Hey, I want to talk a little bit about the value of damage in raids, specifically for guilds that aren't clearing the raid so early on that they're perpetually undergeared, which I think applies to everyone who's not in the top 10, top 20 guilds in the world. So I had a conversation the other day where someone said, Zaskarn being hotfixed was a real problem because it created this massive incentive for guilds that killed him, even post hotfix, to infinitely extend, because re-clearing him was really a giant waste of time. And especially for guilds that killed him pre-hotfix, it was sort of a no-brainer to extend and not have to deal with reprogressing that boss. That latter point I think is pretty obvious. But one thing I disagreed with was that I claimed even if Zaskarn had been released in his current state, it would have been correct for almost every guild to permanently extend after killing Rashok. And he disagreed a lot with this. He pointed out that the raid has all these good trinkets in the first few bosses, so you get a lot of gear from re-clearing. So let's go through that. Let's look at some examples. I picked two random DPS specs just to look at the value that they gain from these raid trinkets. I didn't really pre-select these or look at all the specs to find the ones that best fit my argument. I literally just picked random specs. But it's important that we pick specs that are sort of middle of the pack good for these trinkets. You don't want to pick a class that gets 8,000 DPS from having an Elementium Pocket Anvil, because obviously you're going to give that trinket to that class the first time you kill that boss. So we're sort of assuming like the very best power users of these trinkets got them on the first kills, or they got a heroic version. So we're just going to look at specs that could be plausibly playing two Mythic Plus trinkets and are looking to upgrade to one of the premier raid trinkets on a re-clear. Now the other contentions I'm making are that for any of these guilds that aren't in the top 20, 25 in the world, everyone is over 441 average by the second or third week, just because that was extremely easy to do with the upgrade system. Everyone has basically full heroic tier by the third week, because that was extremely easy to do with how many free tier pieces you got from Omni tokens. People just don't really need off pieces, because everything can either be crafted or farmed from Mythic Plus at this point. So really the only thing we're going into the raid to get is higher item level tier or trinkets. Now, the problem with the higher item level tier is that these first bosses are not on the myth track. So, or the myth track didn't exist when you would have been deciding to extend or re-clear. At this point now it does, but at this point everyone who cares about the game is like 445 item level, so the myth track doesn't really advance your point anyway. But we're saying off pieces don't really matter because they were 441. Tier pieces don't really matter because everyone was already 441 tier from heroic. So the only thing that really comes down to is trinkets, and maybe some tiny off piece upgrades worth a couple hundred DPS, but nothing really to worry about. So if we look at Havoc Demon Hunter here, their second worst dungeon trinket is Harlan's Loaded Dice, which gives them 11,000 DPS at 441. If they go to a 441 Pocket Anvil, they gain 2,300 DPS. If we look at a Balanced Demon Hunter who's playing something like a Spiked Tongue at 441 for their second worst trinket, they gain something like 1,600 DPS, 1,500 DPS, going up to a full stack Chromatic Essence trinket. Although this is again sort of a overrepresentation, because maybe you're not getting all the trinket buffs until actually fairly deep into the patch. So what other trinkets are there out there? There's the Pocket Anvil, there's the Chromatic Essence, there's the Screaming Black Dragon Scale. That's about it. Maybe you could argue for the Bomb Dispenser, if you're a guild that cleared Zaskarn and you're thinking about re-clearing Zaskarn in this hypothetical world where it's the post-hotfix version and it's really easy to re-clear. So maybe you say, these DPS trinkets are worth something like 6,000 DPS for the raid. 2,300 for my Demon Hunter, 1,500 for the balance, another 2K from random trinkets for the other people. And then you say, some of the people that participate in this raid will get a $5 in their vault. So maybe we get another 4,000 DPS from people opening up those trinkets the next week on the next reset. All in 10,000 raid DPS. For healers, this is a log from Honolulu, which is like a top 30 world EU guild. I just picked a random healer who had Rashok's Heart. It looked like it did 8,000 HPS. So maybe they gain 4,000 to 6,000 over their next best healing trinket, because Rashok's Heart is pretty fucking phenomenal as a healer trinket. So, again, maybe you say we're getting another 4k HPS on top of the 6k because some other healer opens a great trinket in their vault. All in, raid gains 10k damage, 10k healing per second. In the hypothetical ideal 5-minute sim version. Well, luckily, Magmorax is basically just a 5-minute sim boss, so we can look and see. They did something like 1 million HPS and 1.8 million DPS, so they're gaining, 1% of healing and 60 basis points, 0.5% of damage from these trinkets. Well, we got to compare that to the opportunity cost of going and getting these trinkets. To take something like 2 hours for a reclear of the first 5 or 6 bosses, maybe 90 minutes if you're efficient, but these are mythic bosses. Like a guild that is clearing the raid slow enough that they might consider, reclearing in the 3rd week, probably is going to wipe 1 or 2 times to Rashok, might wipe on some other random fight, going to be a little slow in the trash. It's not going to be the most efficient outfit, because if it were more efficient, they would be, top 50 world, and the raid would have been cleared by now. So let's say it's 2 hours for a reclear. There's some time lost swapping people in and out, getting your comp ready for the next progress boss, stuff like that. 2 hours is a lot of time. People don't think it is because their raid night is 3 hours or 4 hours long, but 2 hours is a lot of time in progression. So how much is it? Well, we can look and see. If you killed Zaskarn and you're thinking about reclearing, up ahead of you, you have 11 hours of Neltharion prog, 3.5 hours of Magmorax prog, and maybe like 19 hours of Sarkareth prog. All in, maybe 30 to 35 hours of raid time ahead of you. You're spending 2 hours to gain 1% at best damage and healing, and you only have 35 hours of progress left. That means you're spending more than 5% of your expected remaining progress time to gain 1% throughput. Now, 1% throughput doesn't actually save you 1% progression time. Until you're at a very, very high level of rating, almost all of your wipes will be because of execution mistakes. And that's especially true on Sarkareth and Neltharion, where the things that make you wipe often kill the entire raid. It's very rare that people get to Sarkareth and lose to the enrage timer. Overwhelmingly, once you get into a P3 pull where no one has completely destroyed the raid in the first 6 minutes, the boss just falls over and dies 15 seconds before the enrage, because there's virtually no damage check on that fight, and the only healing check is in P1. So it's not like that 1% damage and healing is actually saving you 1% of your progression time. It's really saving you on any pull that would have been a kill pull with 1% more damage or healing, or like any pull where someone died but would have lived with 1% more healing or something like that. It's basically like 0 pulls. I think it's actually safe to say that having 1% more throughput saves you between 0 and 5 pulls for all of Sarkareth and probably all of Neltharion. Maybe it saves you a couple more on Magmorax, because that's really a boss where it's a boss where mistakes kill individual people, not the entire raid, and where you will kill the boss at the enrage timer for a lot of guilds. And so having that extra throughput actually does probably save you, like 5 pulls, even though, it saves you maybe the same number of pulls that it saves you on Sarkareth and Neltharion, but because Magmorax is a 40 pull boss and the other ones are, 150 pull bosses, relatively speaking, you're saving more on Magmorax. But all in, there's no way you're saving 1% of your expected progression time with this reclear. It's just not worth it. I think this is just fairly simple math with pretty unobjectionable assumptions. Like, yes, everyone should have 441 gear in all their off pieces by the time you're deciding to reclear Rashok, unless you're Team Liquid and you have 1 reset of gear. These just all seem like sort of obvious truisms to me that other people seem to disagree with. So let's talk about why people reclear. I think my operating theory is that a lot of people who raid don't actually want to progress. And this is sort of an obvious revealed preference because they don't do things that would make progression raiding less fun for the sake of clearing the raid quicker. You know, people will often show up to raid nights having not looked at any videos of the boss, not looked at any logs, no idea what the boss really even does. Or if they know like the heroic version and, you know, the ready description of the mythic mechanic and didn't think about it at all. This is because they care about like just playing the game with their friends and not really trying to kill the bosses quickly. You know, people will intentionally do things in progression that make them less likely to kill the boss. They will do damage to ads when the ads were going to die anyway and wouldn't change the outcome of the pull at the expense of their own boss damage. You see this happen all the time. On every fight with ads, there are multiple players in your raid who save cooldowns or do a fuck ton of damage to the ads, even though those ads were never an impediment to killing the boss. This is true of the small ads on Sarkrath. It's true of the small ads on Kurog. It's true of, you know, all the random ads on Razageth, besides the one with the shield that actually did have to be broken. You know, people just lose their mind and they do stupid things. People raid sort of more to satisfy their own ego in a lot of ways, of like having a high parse number on a progression kill and feeling good about that, or, you know, clearing the raid on their own terms rather than clearing the raid as efficiently as possible. You see people complain when they get assigned a mechanic in progression. If you think you're a good player, especially if you think you're better than the average player in your raid, you should be happy if a mechanic gets assigned to you because you're going to do it correctly and not fuck it up. If you think you're not good, then you should be taking immediate steps to rectify that. Like, there's only two states of the world. Either you think you're good enough to do the mechanics and you should be happy to get them assigned to you because you'll do them correctly and, you know, save the raid some time, or you're not expecting to do well with mechanics, in which case the only thing you should be thinking about is how to do the mechanics properly, because those are the things that wipe your raid. All this is to say that people re-clear raids because they like having gear, because they like feeling powerful and doing a lot of damage, and they don't really like clearing raids efficiently. That's sort of a secondary concern that no one actually thinks about when they do when they make these decisions about, you know, how to gear or how to approach the raid. And then the other night I came up with this other hypothetical scenario, which is, imagine you reach a progression boss for the first time, and you do the first pull with the mandate that none of the DPS players are allowed to do their rotation. The only thing they're allowed to do is hit defensives or health pots, look at what the boss is doing, and do the mechanics properly. I think if you do one pull like that at the start of a progression boss, you will save more than one pull of total in future progression. And I think not only do you save the one pull that you did without any DPS, I think that the optimal number of pulls that you should do like this is probably in the low tens of percents of all of your pulls on the boss. That is to say, if you're expecting to pull a boss 300 times, I think it is totally reasonable that you do 60 pulls with no one doing their rotation, only performing the mechanics, or, you know, doing the bare minimum amount of damage required to progress the boss to the next stage, like P1 Razageth. I think it's probably correct that you intersperse these kinds of pulls with regular progression pulls where people do damage. Like, you do 10 pulls where people play it normally, and then you do 3 where no one hits their buttons and just tries to survive. And I think that this would be a dramatic progression improvement for a lot of guilds, all but the very best guilds. It just seems clearly obvious to me that almost every wipe in progression that guilds outside the top 5, top 10 in the world face are a result of mechanics being played improperly and not a lack of throughput. Sometimes, like Sarkrath P1, there's a lack of healing throughput, and maybe this is actually just a better argument to gear healers more aggressively in worse guilds, because they paper over mistakes that good players wouldn't make. But no one ever hits damage checks, except on, really difficult damage check fights like, Taros or Rashok or Sludge Fist or whatever. But until you actually hit the enrage on those fights, you're not actually losing to damage. You're losing to player mistakes. It's a very common phenomenon that middling guilds will kill a boss on the very first pull that they get into the last phase with everyone alive. Like, if you have everyone alive on almost any boss with both of your battle reses, the boss just falls over. And people are astounded, like, oh, wow, our best pull was 15%, and then the boss completely fell over. It's like, yeah, no one was doing catastrophically terrible things to the raid that pull, and that's the reason why you killed it. It has nothing to do with damage. It has everything to do with people actually, like, opening their eyes and playing the fight correctly for once. Yeah, those are my thoughts. I think people massively overrate the value of throughput. I think that this culture is enforced because the only way you can tell how good a player is through logs. So people are incentivized to do good damage at the expense of actually killing bosses properly. Sort of a Goodhart's law, where like what gets measured gets managed, and so people try and do more damage and think about how to do more damage, and they don't actually think about how to kill bosses better, and they make a lot of really crazy decisions in the pursuit of getting more damage and not killing bosses quicker.